So in terms of dependence, it can rather be said that the biblical authors were well aware of these other accounts and were clearly writing a polemic against these accounts in many instances. While the assurance from a deity is a common theme, there are some differences, and in particular, two of these are that in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the god Enlil is furious that there were survivors of the flood, and then in Atrahasis, the text actually concludes with 3 punishments on humanity to essentially control the overpopulation issue that they faced initially. Now, another difference is the duration of the flood within each of these accounts. You'll actually notice that within Eridu, Atrahasis, and Gilgamesh, they're actually quite similar. You essentially have the flood lasting for 1 week, where Eridu and Atrahasis are identical. The only difference in Gilgamesh is that instead of 7 days and 7 nights, you have 6 days and 7 nights. But pretty much everybody's just going to say it's right at a week. Whereas within the biblical text, the time frame is actually written as a chiasm. It opens up, you have 2 periods of 7 days, followed by a period of 40 days, then 150 days, and then it all reverses back on itself. So you get another 150, another 40, and then another 2 periods of 7 days. And essentially there's 2 schools of thoughts on this. One is that the author is essentially letting you know that the flood lasted for 1 year. The other school of thought is that it was 1 year and 10 days. And that 1 year and 10 days is significant when you consider the Day of Atonement that was mentioned earlier and when the Day of Atonement was celebrated in terms of the Israelite calendar. And similar to the duration of the flood, we have the number of deities within each account. Now, again, this is going to be where Eridu, Atrahasis, and Gilgamesh are essentially identical, because in each of these accounts, there's multiple gods. They have specific roles. So there's an emphasis on the pantheon, whereas the biblical text is characterized by a singular monotheistic God. And actually in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the text states that even the gods were afraid of the flood weapon. And so what we see in these accounts outside of the biblical text is that the gods actually cannot agree amongst themselves on what should be done regarding humanity, and even in terms of the details of the flood. And they are also not in full control, where in the biblical text, it is God acting alone, who is also in control. And sticking with the themes of numbers, we'll talk about the number of survivors. These vary within each text. Within the biblical text, there's 8 total survivors. This would be Noah and his family. In Eridu, there's Ziusudra and possibly his family, although the details are unclear. In Atrahasis, it typically just focuses on the hero. There's not really mention of anybody else. However, his family was on board with him, and there was also a group of people that were in his house when he transformed it into a boat. So there is some indication there that all of these people would have survived too. It's just not clearly outlined within the text. And within Gilgamesh, you have Utnapishtim and his wife are the only survivors. And so we can see here that with a number of survivors, this actually might imply differences within cultural values on community. And we talked earlier about how one of the similarities was to construct a vessel. And now we'll talk about how the vessel specifications were different within each account. So within the biblical text, it provides specific dimensions of the ark, and you can find that in Genesis 6, 15 through 16. In Eridu, the information is once again missing. In Atrahasis, the details are minimal, though it roughly describes a round vessel that's about 230 feet in diameter with 20-foot walls. And then in Gilgamesh, it describes a cube-shaped ark and uses the language that the length and the width need to be in harmony. Now, in terms of the survival outcome of each account, there are stark differences here, and these different outcomes could suggest varying understandings within each culture of divine human relationships. Within the biblical text, you have God establishing a covenant. In Eridu, you have Ziusudra, who was granted life like a god's and who lived among the gods after this flood event. Within Atrahasis, the gods eventually agree to control the human population, but they do this through means of instituting 3 punishments. This was regarding the ability to have children, infant mortality, as well as celibacy. And then in Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim and his wife receive immortality, and this emphasizes personal reward for their survival. And there's also major differences within the moral implications from each text. Within the biblical account, it offers strong moral teachings about righteousness, whereas in Eridu, there's less focus on morality, but this is likely due to the fragmentary nature of the text. And then in Atrahasis, it emphasizes the importance of following divine wisdom. So right there, that's fairly similar to what we see in the biblical account. But in Gilgamesh, the moral lessons are implied, but they're slightly obscured. And this is because it's really more about Gilgamesh's personal quest for immortality rather than Utnapishtim. Although Utnapishtim does have quite the conversation with Gilgamesh, essentially asking him why he's on this quest for immortality, that it's essentially useless to do so, that he's abandoned being the king of his city to go on this quest, that All of his clothes are ragged and tattered. And so again, while there are some similarities, we see Genesis standing out in terms of its consistent moral clarity. Now, another major difference to note, although it doesn't pertain to the details within the story, is the preservation of the documents. And when we compare the biblical text to Eridu, Genesis, Atrahasis, as well as the Epic of Gilgamesh, what we actually have in terms of the latter three, the preservation of these documents is on fragmented clay tablets with unfilled gaps. And actually, all of these documents were lost to history for a large amount of time. For instance, Eridu Genesis was not discovered until 1893. And although later versions of the flood episode from Atrahasis had been known for a long time, the structure of the epic and therefore the context of the story was not understood until fragments were discovered during the 19th century and a more complete version that was actually found in 1965. And the Epic of Gilgamesh was discovered in 1848. However, there was a man named George Smith who actually presented fragments of the flood story from the Epic of Gilgamesh in a paper that he gave in 1872. But when we contrast that to the biblical text, we have the biblical text largely preserved through scroll technology. And yes, there's a lot of fragments and incomplete versions of the biblical text. However, the biblical text, since it has been compiled together, has gone unbroken generation to generation. There has not been a time in history since its writing where the biblical text was simply lost to known existence. And so again, this doesn't pertain to the actual details within the story, but this is something that is important to recognize from a historical perspective. And now that we've broadly discussed the similarities and differences between these four flood myths, we need to return to the question of, was the biblical flood myth stolen from any one of these other three ancient Near Eastern flood myths? Now, there's multiple viewpoints and suggestions as to the relationship between these stories. And really, we can break these down into three broad categories. And believe it or not, one of these is that the Mesopotamian literature actually borrowed from Genesis. Now, I'm not going to spend any time on this at all. This is incredibly unlikely. And in terms of scholarship, there is little to no scholarship that supports this, with the exception of maybe a handful of people. There's also the thought that the biblical account emerged independently. There's a scholar by the name of Kenneth Matthews who states in his commentary that is titled Genesis 1 through 1126, it is now agreed that the Hebrew account was independent and the versions testify to a widely remembered corpus of events. So he's essentially making the argument here that the biblical account actually emerged independently of these other accounts. And then there's obviously the viewpoint that has been the focus of this video, and that is that the authors of the Genesis flood myth stole from the Mesopotamian literature and accounts that we have looked at within this video. Now, there's a very good paper that was written by, I believe it's Dr. Amanda Norsker, and it's titled Genesis 6, 5 through 11 and 17, a rewritten Babylonian flood myth, and I'd recommend giving it a read. But she has two quotes that present this viewpoint. She said, this is done, she's talking about this paper, this is done to present some of the clearest evidence of the Genesis account being a rewriting of the Babylonian flood myths based on a familiarity with a written version of the Gilgamesh flood story. And then this is what she states in the conclusion. Thus, there is evidence of a development from Atrahasis to Gilgamesh to Genesis. However, there is going to be scholarship that pushes back against this stronger language that seems to suggest that the biblical authors stole or simply just repurposed material that they themselves had no prior knowledge of. And there's a quote from Edward Bridge in his entry in the Lexham Bible Dictionary in the Atrahasis Epic that I believe sums up the relationship pretty well. Now, he is speaking specifically about the biblical text compared to the Atrahasis Epic, although I think the quote works well when we look at all four of these myths in comparison. And this is what it states. The flood narrative in the Atrahasis Epic is characterized more by its differences than similarities to the account in Genesis 6 through 9. But a lot of these similarities involve things such as divine origins, that the stories have a central flood myth hero, or that pitch was used to make the ship watertight. But when we look at perhaps some of the biggest differences, we see some very sharp contrast within the biblical account compared to Eridu, Atrahasis, and Gilgamesh. And two of these major differences are that within the biblical text, God is in complete control of the flood. Whereas in Eridu, Atrahasis, and Gilgamesh, the gods actually cannot agree in terms of the flood, and they do not have full control. There's actually a line from both Atrahasis and Gilgamesh that states that the gods were afraid of the, quote, flood weapon. And then in terms of judgment, within the biblical text, the flood is brought about as a judgment against the violence and corruption of humanity on the earth. Whereas in Atrahasis and Gilgamesh, the judgment is because of overpopulation and that humanity is too noisy and disturbing the gods' sleep. And a quote that does a really good job of stating this is taken from Dr. Longman and Dr. Waltman's book, The Locked World of the Flood. And they state this: the similarities in the telling of the flood story between the Eridu Genesis, Atrahasis, Gilgamesh Tablet 11, and the biblical account may be explained not by the necessarily literary borrowing, but by the fact that this story has been passed down from generation to generation by those who float on the same cultural river. And then they actually go on to say, I just have this included because I think it's an interesting thought to think about, that the literary theological interpretation of the event is inspired, not the event itself. And then there's this quote taken from the textbook, A Survey of the Old Testament, and it says, "Many who have done thorough linguistic and literary analysis conclude that literary dependence cannot be demonstrated. Here, as in most of the parallels in the primeval history, it is considered more likely that Mesopotamian and biblical traditions are based on a common source. More likely, the two literary traditions simply imply that common traditions circulated throughout the ancient world." So in terms of dependence, it can rather be said that the biblical authors were well aware of these other accounts and were clearly writing a polemic against these accounts in many instances. And this should come as no surprise because there's actually been instances where the old Babylonian versions of the Enuma Elish have been found side by side with the Assyrian versions. And the name of the Babylonian gods were changed to the name of the Assyrian gods. So this should give us clear indication that within the ancient world, the cultures were familiar with the rivaling religious myths that surrounded them. And in terms of this common source language, there's going to be a lot of people that actually link this common source back to common knowledge of a real event from the past. All right, everyone, I hope you found this brief video of the differences in the ancient flood narratives beneficial. Now it's your turn to share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you'd like to see the full video that this clip came from, you can click here. Or if you'd like to see a video that YouTube is recommending for you, you can click here. Thanks so much, and I'll see you on the next one.